All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of The Big Ben Show. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can follow me on X at bdomenech. You can follow the show on X and Instagram at Big Ben Show Fox. We hope that you are checking out the clips and sharing them with friends as we are putting more and more of this show online. We appreciate your responses and how much feedback we're getting. Today, I'm going to spend most of the show, it's a packed show, talking about what's going on in Iran and the Middle East. But I wanted to talk to you about my opinions coming out of this interesting situation in Texas with primaries and battles, often ones that were pitting Democrat on Democrat in terms of the different fights that were happening at the congressional level, thanks to redistricting and the like. And also, of course, the statewide races that are going to receive even more attention have already proven to be enormously expensive when it comes to the primaries on both sides, but also now are headed on the Republican side to a runoff. And for Democrats, a choice was made to go in an interesting direction. This was a race that was changed when one Jasmine Crockett, a rising star in the Democratic Party and one of their best communicators when it comes to inspiring people, decided to throw her hat into an uphill battle against an incumbent in John Cornyn, who has been relatively popular until the last couple of years in Texas, when he has been criticized from his right and now faces opposition from Ken Paxton, the very controversial and often scandal-plagued AG of the state, who has been nonetheless very popular among people who are diehard supporters of President Trump, who are willing to forgive all of his different sins in order to have someone who is much more of a loyalist than John Cornyn, who has a few centrist tendencies, has been. This is Texas, and they always have to make a determination whether they're going to spend a ton of money going after these big statewide races that always have appealed to them, have frustrated them ever since the days of Ann Richards, and has really been something that has been left just out of reach for them. We saw the attempts by Beto O'Rourke, by Colin Allred, by Beto O'Rourke, and by Beto O'Rourke again. And it's one of these things that I think is really an uphill battle for Democrats, but one that is not far as uphill as it has been in the past. We've seen the demographic changes in the state. We've also seen Donald Trump lose some of the Hispanic support that he had in the past, but we're still talking about a situation where there were people who were worried about Ted Cruz last time around, turned out not to be a problem. There were people who were worried about what was going to happen when it came to other statewide races, and Republicans have still found a way to hold on. So the question really became, were they going to go down the road of nominating someone who was painted as more extreme? And for the Democrats last night, they decided to make what they view as the pragmatic decision.
Allred has already stated, we encourage each and every one of you to remain resilient. We cannot allow this type of behavior to be rewarded, because so long as they know that they can win, even if it means cheating, then they will continue to do it. So I am asking you, I am begging you to make sure that you go ahead and figure out where it is that you are supposed to vote, stand in line, wait in line.
We don't have any of the results because there was a lot of confusion today. And so, our Democratic Party chair, Cardall Coleman, he beat me to the punch, as myself and Colin Allred we're about to file a lawsuit to keep the voting polls open. We were able to keep the polls open, but I can tell you now that people have been disenfranchised.
Crockett's not wrong. What went down in Dallas is a situation that Democrats, I think, are going to have a lot of questions about going forward. Whether it would have been enough to change the outcome of her primary loss to James Talarico or not, that's something that I think is probably unlikely. Talarico is the nominee, and he's the one whose Democrats have decided to throw against either Cornyn or Paxton. The likelihood of Cornyn increased slightly when it came to the primary because he outperformed a lot of the polls that said in advance that Paxton was probably going to win, and perhaps win by as much as 5 points. Instead, Cornyn came out on top, buoyed by a lot of supporters up and down I-35 who find Paxton's personal history probably and some of his other scandals to be something that they don't want to see in the statewide candidate, and perhaps other voters who are savvy enough to know that it's a lot easier to hold that seat with an incumbent in Cornyn than it is with rolling the dice, especially in an off-year election with someone like Paxton. But they'll be up against whoever comes out of that runoff, this James Talarico figure, who is, from my perspective, the worst kind of fake moderate that exists within the Democratic Party today. He is depicted and described again and again as being someone with moderate tendencies or centrist tendencies, and frankly, it's only a few analysts in the so-called mainstream media and legacy press who are willing to point out that his record is actually more progressive than Jasmine Crockett's on numerous different counts. There's a reason why her appeal was to a broader swath of minority voters, to Black and Hispanic Texans, than Talarico's was to all of the white voters in Austin, essentially coming out and deciding that he was going to be the candidate. And that's because he is completely a fake moderate. I think of him as the Abigail Spanberger of Texas. He has the Harvard degree. He has the imprimatur of the likes of Stephen Colbert. But what does this guy actually believe? Well, forget the policy for a second. Let's just listen to him when it comes to one of the things that Democrats like to tout about him, which is his ability to talk about religion.
Here's the biblical evidence to support the opinion of being pro-abortion.
I think the story I would go to is the story of Mary. Mary is probably my favorite figure in the Bible, the mother of Jesus. And, you know, she's an oppressed peasant teenage girl living in poverty under an oppressive empire as a Jew. And she has a vision from God that she's going to give birth to a baby who's going to bring the powerful down from their thrones, going to scatter the proud, who's going to send the rich away empty. I mean, this revolutionary song that she sings, it's called the Magnificat. And it's actually been banned by certain authoritarian regimes because it is so radical. But I say all this in context of abortion because before God comes over Mary and we have the incarnation, God asks for Mary's consent, which is remarkable. I mean, go back and read this in Luke. I mean, the angel comes down and asks Mary if this is something she wants to do. And she says, if it is God's will, let it be done. Let it be. Let it happen. So to me, that is an affirmation in one of our most central stories that creation has to be done with consent. You cannot force someone to create. Creation is one of the most sacred acts that we engage in as human beings.
You can go back and you can read Luke and try to find the passage that James Talarico is talking about there, and you'll be bereft of it because that's not something that exists. In fact, the angel, when sent to Mary, announces it to her, and there is no asking for consent. That is not something that happens in the Bible. That is something that he is inventing purely out of thin air to try to twist one of the most sacred moments in the Bible to his effort to make sure that women can kill babies up until the point of birth, which is, from my perspective, about one of the most evil things you can use scripture to do. We are warned that certain figures who come from the bad place tend to do that. But it's not the only thing that he says about religion that should give you a little bit of pause of whenever you hear the legacy media talk about his centrism.
Is both masculine and feminine and everything in between. God is non-binary.
Okay. All right. So that's the territory that we're in. Look, you are going to hear about James Talarico, and he's going to get the Annie Leibovitz treatment. He is going to be held in front of you just as they did with Mayor Pete, just as they did with Beto, and just as they try to do with any of these figures who they take, who have radical, progressive, and in this case, heretical ideas, and they put them front and center and say, shouldn't you like this person? He talks about scripture. You should be okay with him being your next senator from Texas. The answer is no. Texas should not be okay with someone like this. They should have been okay, I think, personally, with Jasmine Crockett. But this guy, this is a bridge too far. I'm Ben Domenech. You're listening to another edition of The Big Ben Show. We'll be back with a loaded show right after this. Happy to welcome to the Big Ben Show the other Ben Shapiro. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. You can obviously follow Ben on X at Ben Shapiro and at Ben Shapiro Show and check out all of the offerings that he has at the Daily Wire, which I've been happy to join as the new opinion editor. Ben, I want to talk to you about what's going on in the Middle East and Iran. But before I get to that, I wanted to ask you a few reactions from the things that we saw play out in Texas in their primary elections. What are your main takeaways from, first on the statewide level, the decision that the Democrats made to go with Talarico over Crockett, and the somewhat surprising fact that Cornyn was able to stay ahead of Paxton on the Republican side?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing to know about the Democrats is that they are not running stupid. I mean, obviously, if you were to sort of game out the worst case scenario for Republicans, and again, Texas is a very, very red state, so I doubt that whoever the Republicans end up nominating is going to lose to the Democrats. But if Democrats are trying to select the most electable candidate in a general election, probably Talarico is their bet. He's sort of newfangled Beto O'Rourke. He's got all the same drawbacks. He's got many of the same benefits. Again, they don't have a great record there, but Talarico defeating Crockett is an important thing for Democrats in the sense that they are still tethered to some sense of political reality. Crockett, of course, is wildly off-putting, and across the state of Texas, broad scale, is not supremely popular. On the Republican side of the aisle, there's sort of the surprising fact that as you say, Cornyn, the incumbent, was able to stay ahead of Paxton. On the other hand, in the runoff, it's pretty clear that Paxton is going to have an advantage. Wesley Hunt, who won about 14% of the vote, most of those votes are likely, according to pollsters, to move over to Paxton. And so you do end up with the riskiest scenario for Republicans, which is a Paxton versus Talarico fight. Paxton obviously has an enormous amount of personal baggage, corruption allegations, sexual peccadillos, and all of the rest. So is this a Republican Party that is making smart moves? Yeah, I would doubt it. It seems that Republicans have a habit, unfortunately, of nominating not particularly wonderful Senate candidates. It probably won't cost them in Texas. It has cost them in the past. I think there are at least 4 senators right now for the Democrats who should be Republicans in Georgia and Arizona because of decisions like this.
Mm-hmm. There's a real pressure campaign in the media at the D.C. level right now in reaction to what they saw in Texas to try to get Donald Trump to endorse John Cornyn. He had obviously been playing both sides, as he always does when he's trying to choose between different candidates. But given the fact that Paxton wasn't able to pull ahead, do you think that Trump endorsement becomes at all more likely? And if it does it make a difference?
I could see a world where it becomes more likely. I think that President Trump understands that Texas might be the swing state in the Senate right now. So that's not a seat that Republicans can afford to lose. Obviously, Maine is really fraught. North Carolina is really fraught. Ohio, Sherrod Brown is really fraught. That's 3 seats that may go away in this election cycle. And now you're down to 50-50 plus a J.D. Vance tiebreak. And obviously, Alaska is a little bit dicey, and Texas could theoretically be dicey. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for the president to endorse. On the other hand, he may just say, listen, Texas is Texas. I've got this thing. Republicans have this. Chances that Talarico ends up as the actual senator, really low. So I would say, again, not the answer people want. It's probably a coin flip as to whether the president intervenes in that primary.
Mm-hmm. I do want to ask your opinion on one more outcome that I think surprised some people who weren't paying attention to it, but not those of us who were, which was the Dan Crenshaw result. Does that surprise you, considering the fact that his career at one point looked to be one that was going to be pretty impressive, and now to have a kind of flame out the way that he did? What did you think of that outcome?
I like Dan Crenshaw personally. I know Dan. I think that his opponent in that race, a lot of people are trying to turn this into sort of this is the horseshoe right versus the traditionalist right. And that's not right. I mean, his opponent in that race, Toth, was endorsed by Ted Cruz. Dan had made himself an enormous number of enemies sort of in D.C. He obviously is very outspoken on a wide variety of topics, not just in the media, but against other members of the party. And so there's a lot of institutional anger at Dan in that particular race. But I think that it's too easy in a read sort of to suggest that Crenshaw was the old school neocon Republican versus Toth, who is somehow the new isolationist Republican Party. It's not true. Toth basically mirrors a lot of Crenshaw's politics. It's just that he doesn't have some of Dan's baggage, I think.
I share that opinion. The other thing that seems to me to be going on here is that is an overall narrative that the legacy media is applying to virtually every circumstance that we're currently seeing. Nowhere more so than when it comes to their coverage of disagreements about the Iran decision that the president made, one which I know that we both think is a courageous one, though not one without significant risk in terms of what comes next. Why do you think that narrative has had such presence within the legacy media? Why do they want that to be the narrative about what the fight is going on within Republican circles?
Well, I mean, I think that the legacy media has a heavy stake always in the idea that Trump has broken his base, because the one thing that has never happened for President Trump, literally his entire political career since 2015, is his base breaking. And the evidence is that his base is not even close to breaking on this particular issue. Every single poll has Republican support for the operation in Iran at above 80%. That is not a break issue for Republicans. In fact, the people who are out screaming in the wind right now, people like Tucker Carlson or Megyn Kelly or Candace Owens or Nick Fuentes, now, many of those people have already said they're not voting for Republicans in 2026 and encourage people not to do so. That's Fuentes as well as Owens. The other two have been personally chided by the president for their coverage of the situation and are telling overt lies about what's happening. I think the legacy media are very much invested in this idea that there's about to be a takeover of the Republican Party by this horseshoe, right-wing, woke right, neo-isolationist wing, because they understand that if the Republican Party turns into that, it probably loses. The reality is that most Americans are pretty hawkish. In fact, I thought that the most telling poll was not of Republicans on Iran. There's a poll that came out from CBS about the Iran action. And what it found is that if this action were to last days or weeks, which it is likely to, then it has 76% approval, which is really, really high. If it lasts months, then that goes down to 46% approval. And of course, if it lasts years, then you're down at 13% approval. In other words, the American people have the good sense to understand that they don't want a long war, but also that Iran had to be taken care of, which is exactly the case that the president is currently making. So the legacy media are always willing, out of hatred of President Trump, to rehab people that they found absolutely despicable 5 seconds ago. The Pod Save America bros are on the Tucker Carlson bandwagon. They're praising him literally every day. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who the media labeled a complete moron and dunderhead, and that part was true. Now that she has turned against the president, suddenly she is a person who's appearing on The View and being treated as a valuable foreign policy font of wisdom. That is not a mistake. I mean, the media have basically decided that anything that opposes what Trump is doing is good, and that is the simple rubric to apply here.
Just take the strange new respect and shoot it directly into my veins. the thing that is jarring to me about it too, and you know this because you've been in this industry long enough and you pay attention to the decisions that people make. It is so apparent to me that there are decisions that people are making, including some of the ones that you just mentioned, that are in no way driven by an ideological shift, a philosophical growth, a mindset change that was, compelled by some kind of personal experience or revelation about something they got wrong in the past. So much of this seems to me to be a grift motivated by getting clicks and by personal gripes. In the case of a couple of them, it might actually be mental instability. But the point being, there are so many people who, if you pay any attention to them, you can see the grift going on right in front of you. It's in the room with you right now. Why is that something that people are not willing to call out? Because it'd be different if we were having an ideological debate. We're not with many of these people.
I mean, I think that the reason people aren't willing to call it out is because some of the people who I've mentioned are some of the most vicious actors in media, meaning they spend every waking moment trying to identify enemies and then personally destroy them. That's certainly true of Candace Owens. It's true of Tucker. And increasingly, unfortunately, it's true of Megyn Kelly as well. I think there's a very easy tell as to when somebody in this particular debate is grifting. And that is, will they say President Trump's name? If they will not say President Trump's name, then that means they're grifting. Honestly, because it's President Trump's decision, right? President Trump is the one who is not only leading the effort, but cheerleading the effort, making the orders, designing the policy. So if you don't like what he's doing, then what you really should do, if you had the courage of your convictions, is call out the man who's actually making the call. But you will notice that Tucker will never say President Trump's name. Instead, it's a nefarious cabal of domestic Jews and Israelis who are manipulating the president. Megyn Kelly will not say the president of the United States' name because they are so afraid of the president, and they're afraid that their audience might get mad at them if they actually go up against the president, because it turns out, again, more than 80% of Republicans support the president in his policy in Iran. So instead, what they're doing is trying to grift and have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to appear as these critics of the president's policy who are standing up against conspiratorial elite forces. And at the same time, they don't actually have the courage to call out the guy who's making the call. Megyn Kelly the other day suggesting that Mark Levin and I and Miriam Adelson are the ones who convinced President Trump to do this. I mean, listen, I wish I had that kind of influence with the president of the United States. I can honestly say the last conversation I had with the president of the United States directly was before the election on my show. It's an absurdity. And again, the notion that people are able to sort of get Trump to do whatever they want him to do. If that were true, then Tucker Carlson has had a hell of a lot more access to the president of the United States in the last 2 months than any of the people that Megyn Kelly is mentioning.
What also bothers me about that is, taken to its logical conclusion, they're calling the president an idiot. They're
Correct.
basically saying he's easily manipulated. People can just, sort of feed him things and he's just going to respond to it, which is essentially embracing like a Trump 1.0 vision of how he makes decisions that was advocated for by a lot of legacy media people who turned out to be completely full of it. And what we've learned about this president, and he makes his decisions in his own time and on his own basis. It's not something where you can easily manipulate the guy in this way. And I don't know why they don't get called out by their own listeners and readers on that count. Is it because perhaps they're not watching them because they agree with them, but they're watching them for the entertainment factor?
I mean, I think some of that is for sure true. I mean, some of the people we've mentioned honestly resemble ambulatory psychotics in their approach to the news. And there's a car crash element to some of these shows. I will say that there is something to the idea that people are addicted to the conspiracy. They're addicted to the idea right now that your institutions have betrayed you. And so anyone who suggests a secret look inside that world, or a theory that pries open the closed doors of power, and they're going to expose for you and then liberate you from these conspiratorial elites, that's a pretty sexy pitch to a lot of people right now. And it applies on a wide variety of topics, not just the Iran war. I think that the grievance culture that has infected the right over the course of the last several years is a deep and abiding problem. And I think that what we're watching right now with regard to Middle East policy is a symptom of that problem. I don't think it's the root of that problem. I think that a lot of people will talk about anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism with some of these folks. And what I've said many, many times is that I actually don't think primarily this is about Jews. I think this is about a conspiratorial mindset that very often ends up implicating Jews at the very end of the conspiracy chain. But it comes from a belief that there are systems of power that you don't control and that they are responsible for all your decisions in life. And when you're making that pitch to a broad audience, there are a lot of politicians who literally for thousands of years have done really well off of that pitch. A lot of commentators who have done really well off the pitch that your failures are not your own fault, that the problems in your life are not in your own control, and only they can solve, only they can pry open again that door of power and then usher you a look in. And that's a lot sexier pitch than, the president makes policy. It's either good or it's bad. And we live in a democratic republic and we have a say. And most of the decisions in our life are within our own control.
Mm-hmm. I do want to talk to you about what's going on in the situation regarding Iran as it relates to I don't know how to describe it, shocking to me at least, fact that they just seem to fire missiles in every direction possible in reaction to this decapitation attack. I mean, were you surprised that they start attacking Oman? I mean, this is just like not even. It seemed designed almost in a lab to create a situation where almost everyone lines up opposing you. Do you think that gives you some additional hope that this could have a positive end to this story, even given the fact that we're a long way away from that?
I think that the strategy here was that they were trying to re-engineer Gulf reverse, sort of. So if you recall back to Gulf War I, H.W. Bush, president of the United States, and Saddam Hussein being attacked by allied forces, but not Israel, started firing Scud missiles at Israel. And the goal of firing the Scud missiles at Israel was to bring Israel into the war and then presumably to break up the coalition, because the idea was that the Arabs and the Jews wouldn't sit in the same coalition. So H.W. Bush actually went to the Israelis and said, you just need to absorb these Scud missiles that are flying into your country, which killed some Israelis. I think that Iran was trying to do that in reverse here. I think what they were trying to do was bring the Arabs into the coalition specifically so the Arabs would then say to President Trump, we will not work with the Israelis on this thing. You need to calm this thing down. right? You need to stop this. And instead, what they ended up doing is actually re-enshrining the value of the Abraham Accords, because, of course, some of the countries that they have been attacking most heavily, namely UAE, for example, the Abraham Accords with Israel have been unbelievably durable with regard to the Emirates. I mean, it really is an astonishing thing. The Emirates stood shoulder to shoulder with the Israelis throughout the October 7th war. So did Bahrain. And so many of the countries they were attacking were already sort of working with the Israelis hand in glove. The Saudis were sort of more on the fence, but very quickly it became apparent to the Saudis, hey, wait a second, the Iranian regime could actually topple here, and suddenly that would be a boon to us. And so they ended up on the same side of the page also. Even Qatar is reluctantly getting on board, our greatest supposed ally in the Middle East, whose airbase we are not allowed to use for any of these operations. But Qatar, being fired upon and realizing that Iran was in trouble, is suddenly arresting IRGC members in Qatar, despite the administrations of Tucker Carlson trying to claim that Mossad is being arrested in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. It was a massive miscalculation by the Iranians. I think it's a move that is born of absolute desperation. The basic idea is we can't defend ourselves against this. Our airspace is completely controlled, soup to nuts, by the Israelis and the Americans. We don't have any power in the water. Basically, we are relegated to shooting people in the streets who are resisting us. That's pretty much all they have at this point. And so they're just firing in every direction, hoping someone will get to the president and tell him to stop. And the president is having, frankly, too much fun. I mean, if you watch the president doing his press conferences, the president, he is enjoying American dominance here. And he is enjoying the fact that Iran, which has been on his target list since 1980, and there are interviews of the president in 1980 as a real estate magnate talking about how the United States should put boots on the ground to stop the taking of hostages in Iran. So this has been a consistent position for longer than I have been alive, for half a century for the president of the United States. And the idea that Trump is going to be stopped because somebody from Qatar calls the president and says, hey, things are getting a little rough over here, not going to happen. I think it was a miscalculation. I think you're going to see increasingly desperate plays by the Iranians as they collapse internally and externally. Firing at Turkey is a bizarre move. That was something that happened this morning. Apparently, they fired a missile at Turkey. I assume that was an attempt to get Erdogan, who has been pretty dicey on this. Erdogan is an Islamist dictator. He really is. And Turkey should not be a member of NATO. But I think the goal there was to get Erdogan to get in President Trump's ear, or to get Erdogan to go to the other NATO allies and say, you need to get the president to stop, or NATO is going to have to respond. And that was a failure as well. So, again, it seems to me that these moves right now are discombobulated, disorganized. The regime is in serious trouble.
Mm-hmm. I share your belief on that front, but I'm also concerned about what comes next. And so I wanted to hear your opinion. Is the likeliest end game here one that looks like a military dictatorship? Does it look like a rump version of the regime that can't really express itself via the extension of power anymore realistically? Or is it something that's more positive, more optimistic in terms of the hopes that have been around Washington and have been, frankly, an element of the policy regarding Iran for as long as I've been alive?
So, I mean, there are a lot of possibilities here. I think that the reason the president went is because virtually all of them are better than the current status. And so regardless of what ends up happening afterward, the current status was unsustainable. So basically, there's only one possibility that is worse than what currently happens, which is reconsolidation of an Iranian regime around somebody who has the same principles as the Ayatollah, but somehow they are able to rebuild quickly from the amount of damage being done. I think that's nearly impossible given the amount of damage that's currently being done in Iran. Even a weakened version of the same regime would be a significant benefit to the West. I think it is unlikely, frankly, that the regime survives in its current form. I think that if you were to sort of game out probabilities, the probability that there is a full-scale population uprising, that's a possibility. I don't know that it's 50% possibility. It's probably lower. The possibility that there's somebody in the Iranian army, which is distinct from the IRGC, that the army starts to turn on the IRGC and basically says, listen, we need somebody in control who is not IRGC, and they make a move for power. That is a distinct possibility for sure. Somebody who's not Basij, somebody who is not IRGC. There's the possibility of full-scale civil unrest. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the possibility of Kurds making incursions from Iraq into Iran. The border areas have basically been blown up, and IRGC control of those areas has been stopped. Weapons apparently flowing into that area as well. All of those possibilities are possible. Chaos does not necessarily mean something worse just happened. This I think, is a thing to keep in mind. The kind of notion that you break it, you bought it, the sort of actual neoconservative, actual Colin Powell version of you take out a dictator, now you're responsible for everything that happens, and if chaos breaks out, somehow the United States has to actually step in and manage. That's not true. That's not actually true. The United States was there to diffuse a threat and dismantle a threat. And if it takes a while for the next leadership to consolidate and figure it out, then it takes a while. And that is still better than an Iranian government with the resources and capacity to develop ballistic missiles beyond the capacity of our allies to shoot them down.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's something that people do need to understand, and I hope that there are more voices that start to explain that to them, because I don't think that there are a lot of people who are out there saying that quite just yet. So let's hope that that emerges. You can follow Ben Shapiro on X at Ben Shapiro, and of course, subscribe to The Ben Shapiro Show. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining The Big Ben Show today.
Well, back at you, Ben.
Happy to welcome back to the Big Ben Show, Behnam Ben Taleblu. He is the Iran Program Senior Director and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. You can follow him on X at @TheRealBehnamBT. We have had the opportunity to talk about what was going on in the Iranian regime in the lead up to everything that we saw happen in the past week. And you, I think, did a very good job of giving a balanced and restrained perspective on what could be expected of the people within the regime who've been suffering so much over the past several months and who have been slaughtered in the streets as they protested, etc. What do you believe that the United States and in cooperation with the Israelis were able to achieve in giving those people a real chance at changing the government? Even considering the degree to which those strikes have been effective, do they really have an opportunity now?
In short, not yet. You know, it's always great to be with you. You get right at the heart of the matter. This is the heart of the matter. We can destroy anything above or below ground we want to, likely a similar case with the Israelis. But the question is, will we move the target set from the decapitation operation that's been so successful? I mean, Iran right now is fighting without a commander-in-chief. Let's just please take that into account. Against the defanging mission, which is against their missiles and their launchers and their bases. Will we take it to the next level and go against the apparatus of repression? So far, there's been some limited strikes there. The Israelis have been able to go after a couple of IRGC bases, facilities, police, but if we want to really tip the balance for the protesters, if we want to drive the next round, which I think we should, because this anti-American, this anti-Israeli regime, if it survives this, it'll only suck us back into conflict cycle after cycle after cycle. So if we want to drive the next round, we have to go for that security force cohesion. And unfortunately, that is more of a campaign than an operation. I don't think it can be done in the timeline the president gave out. He said 4 weeks, and he said it might even be sooner than that. But time will tell, because we can destroy a lot in a limited amount of time.
Let's talk about that destruction. The decision was made by the president and his leadership team at the Pentagon and CENTCOM to embark on a campaign that is overwhelmingly air power driven. There's been skepticism in the past about how much that can actually achieve. And that's one of the reasons why the assumptions built in whenever we talk about Iran had always involved boots on the ground, big army moving, that type of thing from the American perspective, which is one of the reasons why the American people, myself included, are hesitant to engage in that type of effort. Given that the president has made the decision to do this way, do you think he's going to have to change things up again going forward? Or is he able to stick to this air power driven campaign, understanding that there is more tolerance for that on the American domestic political side than there is any real representation of, significant American risk of losing lives on the ground within Iran?
I think the president's appetite for military conflict is just like his appetite for diplomacy. He wants something short, sharp, and decisive, and an emphasis on the decisive. Everything else, he can kind of set it and forget it. You see how he fights adversaries at home and abroad. He can do a protracted campaign. But when it comes to the big stuff, guns and bombs, or actual deal-making, he wants that to be decisive. The Islamic Republic right now is keen to avoid giving him this decisive victory. Unfortunately, I do think it's going to be a bumpy road ahead if he wants a political victory. The president will absolutely get a military victory. There will be metrics that say this number of launchers down, this number of commanders killed, this number of missiles intercepted, this number of bases taken out. Will he be able to spin that into a political win without doing some of the other heavier lifts that you've said? I don't think so. But I think he needs to be preparing the American public for a shift to a low-intensity air campaign, but one that is much more sustained. You don't need to take B-2s to the Basij and to the IRGC and to the Iranian police. You need drones. In fact, we have an American drone contingent right there that is modeled off of the Iranian suicide drone and performs probably 10 times as better. But we need more of that kind of creative military thinking, special operations. And I want to end with this. I'm a little concerned because right now as we're speaking, there's news of the CIA potentially funding a Kurdish insurgency. Mr. President, this is not the way to go. There is a real chance to turn an adversary into an ally right now. This would only guarantee you that there's an insurgency that could lead to a failed state rather than to win over the people and keep them going.
The concerns that I've heard, particularly from people who fall into that category of supportive of decapitating the regime, but worried about what comes next of it all, does focus on that. Is there, what would be the ramifications, the fallout from the Americans being perceived as basically picking an insurgency, picking a militia to officially endorse, giving them resources, giving them guns and bombs, giving them every different type of material and resource that they want in order to achieve their ends, particularly if it was the Kurds?
I mean, listen, the Kurds have fought admirably and bravely against adversaries of the United States for a long time across multiple countries. And unfortunately, they have been a repressed population across multiple countries. But the answer to the Middle East, with immense respect to everyone who is in there, all the different backgrounds, all the ethnicities, all the religions, is no more lines in the sand, okay? The problem is we need to build a culture that respects the lines as they are rather than, trying to create new lines without building a new culture. And America should not be doing the social engineering for that kind of stuff. That I can tell you, first-generation Iranian American, that is not the mission of the Department of War or the American National Security State. What we need to do is to win. We need to work by, with, and through people, by, with, and through states. And ultimately here, an insurgency is not going to pave the pathway to taking over Tehran. At best, what it would do is it would tie down security forces, but then there's a risk-reward trade-off because you have a population, the Iranian population, that is the most pro-American and the most pro-Israeli in the heartland of the Muslim Middle East. That's not pretty easy to find right now, post-October 7. And they're ruled over by the most anti-American and the most anti-Israeli government. And the thing that is driving people to come out right now is a more inclusive form of Iranian nationalism. If we segment that out and start picking winners and losers, the result will be like Iraq and Syria, meaning, you won't topple the state fully. There'll be some rump state in the capital, and then there'll be a cordon of wherever the Kurds are, which probably will function better because they'll be holding off and they'll be getting a little bit of American or even potentially even Israeli support. But then you would have, again, shattered one of the last great states in that part of the world, and you won't be able to trade with that state. You won't be able to build back better with that state, and we will guarantee a cycle of instability and violence. So the president can push through here if he chooses to with his air campaign. But I think if we default to insurgency and civil war, we shouldn't be surprised that it's going to look like other insurgencies and other civil wars in the region.
When it comes to the effect of driving this action forward, there has been some after-action debate about whether this was a situation where Israel pushed us to act or vice versa. We've heard, there was a comment from Marco Rubio that some people, I think, were clipping a little bit out of context that was being used to make this argument on social media. The president himself says, if anything, that it was the Americans who were pushing forward, and which would be an indication of something that I believe for a long time, which is that the president actually made the decision about this a long time ago, and has only been stringing things along a little bit when it comes to the Witkoff negotiations and things like that. That's my own perspective. Is it your opinion here that this is entirely that this is something that the administration is truly invested in, or was there a faction internally that convinced the president that this was going to be not easy, but easier than people anticipated? And if it proves to be more difficult, as you've suggested, Does that mean that he backs off? And if so, what does that do to our relationships in the region, particularly with Israel?
You mean for the strike against the Islamic Republic itself? Yeah, so for commencing the war, I actually think we shouldn't make the mistake that many in D.C. made during Trump 1.0, which was to try to play Kremlinology, see who's up, who's down, who's influencing him. The president is shooting from the hip. He's speaking from the heart, and he's actually telegraphing us what he thinks and what he believes in real time. Term 1 on X, Term 2 on Truth Social. You couldn't have more transparency from a commander-in-chief to the population. I don't know how many millions of dollars we spend on communication stuff for the White House and everything else, but you can get more about U.S. policy today.
I hear 10,000 K Street consultants screaming at you right now.
I don't want to do that as my version of Doge, private sector Doge. But listen, the president sees the Iran threat in a very consistent way. And if you go back to even the 80s, the president was informed about this issue when he was not president, when he was just a businessman, by seeing the images that came out of Iran in 1979, the hostage crisis. He saw, while in New York, generation after generation of policymakers fail to deal with fundamentally what is a weak country and what is a weak regime. And the president, unlike other presidents, has not been afraid to exercise raw American power against these sorts of regimes. And he's gambled before, but he's been successful. He left the Iran nuclear deal, World War III didn't start. He killed Qasem Soleimani, World War III didn't start. He took out the regime's uranium enrichment facilities, World War III didn't start. And yes, now we do have a regional war, but we were in a regional war anyway for the past 2.5 years. I mean, where have we been? And that wasn't the president's fault. That October 7th happened on President Biden's fault, on President Biden's watch. So moral of the story is, I think the president, more than anyone else, had a clear theory of the case. The president pulled the trigger. He's the commander-in-chief. And I don't think we should be playing this kind of DC kaleidoscope, who influenced
But it's so much fun, and so many people make a living doing it. You spoke about images. This president is very visual, and he recalls the images that he sees, and he responds to them. One branch of the images that we have been getting out of Iran are the reactions from the people there, especially to the strikes. We've seen bits and pieces of it. How much can we increase that in terms of the availability of the imagery that we have on the ground? We talked before the last time you were here about the problems with getting information out about the various deaths, about the protests and what was happening, just given the lockdown on the internet and the like. Do you think that we're going to be able to get more access to this as of information about what the people inside are experiencing as things go forward?
Well, unfortunately, the regime understands that this is a kind of terrain for them that they can't win on. If people see that after killing the supreme leader of Iran, Iranians across the provinces of that country, not just in the capital, are taking to the streets in the middle of war to dance in front of bus stops, in front of police stations, to yell and shout from their homes, to have parties that are basically going on for hours that the government can't even control, then yeah, they're going to look even weak. And yeah, that's going to put a shot in the arm of the most powerful person on this planet, which is U.S. President Donald Trump. And that'll push him to keep going. And the regime is keen to not have these videos and images come out, which is why, again, during this war, the internet has been throttled. It's not been as throttled as bad as during the protests. There's still a lot of imagery coming out, considerably more than during the protests. But this is why, Congress, the administration, Intel community, this is why they actually have to focus on communications technologies with Iran, Starlink on steroids, direct to cell. There's a lot of low-cost things that cost a lot less than an F-35 that needs to be humming in the background here to help get the Iranians back out onto the street and win this time.
The possibility of blowback is one that the American people are concerned about when something like this happens. So many people ran into me in the last couple of days and said some equivalent of, "Hey, I'm glad that we were able to decapitate the regime, but I'm worried about what comes next, and I'm worried about whether this is going to be a situation where they target places that are key government facilities or that are important to America." There was an immediate reaction to a shooting, obviously in Texas that people connected to it. The president has dismissed that and said that the fellow was a wacko. What?
Forgive me. He was a wacko, but he was naturalized.
Yes.
Despite several arrests. I mean, something went wrong in the system.
Yes.
Forgive me for.
Yeah. No. I think you're correct on that. I still think that there's more to come from that story in terms of learning more about what happened there, because something did go wrong. The level of concern that Americans have, how much of that is real? How much of a capability does Iran have at this point to really reach out and touch them? And if not in America, do they have the capacity to do so for Americans that are closer to them in Europe or, pockets of American populations, bases, et cetera, that we have around the world?
Well, unfortunately, already the Iranians are bombing U.S. bases. They fired on Al Udeid in Qatar. They fired ballistic missiles just a few hours ago. Last night, they had fired drones at the U.S., I think it's consulate in Dubai, and they had also been targeting a U.S. diplomatic facility in eastern Saudi Arabia. So the cat is out of the bag on that one, but that's all the more reason to go big against these guys. When it comes to the threat to American homeland and American lives, I worry about the lone wolf terror threat. I worry about the potential sleeper cell threat. I think we have to mitigate that with a bit of reality, but then also have that force us to have an honest conversation about, well, isn't this what happens when you have an undefended border and 10 to 11 million undocumented people come across the border there illegally? Isn't the chance of that growing anyway? Shouldn't that have forced us to act earlier? And even if none of this was the case, and it is, it's never a good idea to have a bounty on the head of the President of the United States. No. And that existed well before the taking out of Khamenei, well before the nuclear program was struck, and well before anything. It was dating back to the first administration.
Do you think that the Iranian response to this was surprising in the sense that they immediately started flinging missiles around in every which way? I mean, they even shot at Oman. It's like, was that spazzing out, for lack of a better term?
It was literally
something that you expected, or no?
It was expected. I'll tell you why in a second. But once they shot at Oman, the memes went viral. Don't shoot the messenger, bro, because quite literally, the Omanis were in D.C. I think with immense respect to all the Omani diplomats and with immense respect to the White House. I think they came here to annoy the most restraint-oriented elements of the White House on Friday. Yes. And they went on TV to quite literally do more than mediate. They went on TV to lobby for something that was old and presented as new, just so that they could sweeten the deal with the Iranians. Then they turn around, the war starts, and then they're getting shot at by the Iranians. So, my heart does go out to the Omanis here.
Nice try, guys.
But no, Iran had been saying for a month that if they were attacked, even if it was a limited attack, that they would widen the war. And this just to me proves that they didn't learn the lessons of the last time they widened a war, which was in the Iran-Iraq War. Many people forget this, but that was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. And in that conflict, even though a guy that we haven't spoken about a while, Saddam Hussein, even though he started to target Iranian energy first, Iran started to widen the war by going after Kuwaiti and Saudi shipping because they believed that they were keeping Saddam in power and funding his war effort. That brought America into the region rather than kept America out.
Yeah.
And now, instead of fostering the hedging of the GCC countries and getting them to sit down, they're taking down Iranian rockets. They're issuing press statements. I couldn't think of a better advertisement for the Abraham Accords than the Iranian drone hitting a luxury 7-star hotel in the UAE. That is the best advertisement for Abraham Accords.
Mm-hmm. How much is there going to be a real ramification to the fact that the Iranians have essentially pushed all these people together in a box by their response to this?
It is happening in slow motion right now, and it will even happen after the war turns off. Mm-hmm. I mean, these countries rely on trade, they rely on tourism. The airports, literally, Iran has been firing drones at airports. The airports that have been struck are among the busiest transit hubs in this planet. The energy infrastructure that the regime is increasingly beginning to target, and the hedging in Qatari gas and Saudi oil that we're seeing to reflect that is going to be felt later on at the pump. This is not a reason to let the guy with the gun keep running around with the gun. This is an advertisement for good guys with guns stop bad guys with guns.
Last question, and it's one you'll anticipate. Endgame scenario for this. let's say that it's not 4 weeks, but let's say that it's 2 months or something like that of an American sustained campaign, along with a little bit of help from others, and of course the Israeli activity as well. What is the likeliest outcome at the end of that? And is it a new military dictatorship within Iran? Is it something else? If you're looking at the tea leaves right now, how do you feel things are going to go?
So long as the targeting doesn't evolve to go after these forces in a much more localized level, the most likely scenario is leaving a hardline rump state in place, one that can barely project power beyond its borders, or barely project power beyond the capital. Now, that might sound good enough, but that is basically leaving a wounded tiger in place that has every incentive to rebuild and fight and engage in revenge. So I think we are entering a no way out but through situation here. It depends on how successful that campaign is in these 2 months. I think certainly we can defang them with a lot of the missile capabilities. And that's why I'm stressing we have to move from defanging to going against these security forces. Otherwise, they will probably be, most likely bet, a hardline rump state that can't really project power, but that is keen to find a way to strike back at the first opportunity. Mm-hmm. And that's why we can't give them that opportunity.
Well, the one thing that I think could be opposing your view on that, and I do think that your view is correct on, obviously that's why we have you on this show, but I do think that the president is in resolving all family business mode at the moment. He seems to not want to leave the world with anything after the fact that could do damage that could be laid at his feet, essentially. That he wants to just take these things off the map. So
I hope that's the case.
If that view prevails, what does that look like?
If the president really does push for a political win here, and I think he can achieve one, it is long, it is costly. I am not going to lie, U.S. service persons have already died. It is dangerous. But the Middle East is dangerous. But our interests there are real. So because of that, the more optimistic scenario is, again, paving the pathway for protest, that you decapitate and bruise this regime in such a way that it inspires the next round of Iranian protesters. And let me tell you, people say that because 30 to 40,000 were killed in Iran just in a matter of weeks, that has made the population afraid. No, it hasn't. It's made them angry. Mm-hmm. It's instilled this kind of, we have nothing left to lose now. Mm-hmm. That, if it is channeled properly, if it's not wasted on an insurgency, but on a national rebellion, that can generate volume after an airstrike. Volume which, 3 million, 1.5 million in major urban centers, and just going, that can actually get what's left of that rump state and the opportunism that exists on the very low end of Iran's security forces to defect or come off sides. And that's exactly how the revolution happened in 1979. February 11, 1979 is called Victory Day for the Islamic Revolution, not because Khomeini did anything, but that's the day the armed forces, the mass of whom were conscripts, declared their neutrality. Mm-hmm. So get what's left of the guys with guns off and get them to the sidelines.
You can follow Behnam Ben Taleblu on X at @TheRealBehnamBT. He is the Iran Program Senior Director and Senior Fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much for coming.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Happy to be joined on The Big Ben Show. One of my oldest friends in media, Buck Sexton, co-host of the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton Show. You can follow him at Buck Sexton on X, and you should check out his book, Manufacturing Delusion: How the Left Uses Brainwashing, Indoctrination, and Propaganda against you. Congratulations on the book. Buck, how is it going?
Thank you, my friend. The book is going great. It's a New York Times bestseller. We hit number 4 on the list opening week, which is fantastic. But I have found it very amusing how many people, including friends of mine in media, audience from radio for years, are like, it's actually a good book. It's kind of, they're like, so you can actually write? Like, you know how to write the words? I say, yes, I can write the words. I can do the research. And I've been very clear about this. It took me forever, Ben, to get this out because I did everything. I did all the research. I did all the writing. You're a writer yourself.
You even read it.
I even read the audiobook of it. But so I was a one-stop shop. And it's just been so funny. People are like, wow, it's actually really good. It's really interesting. I'm like, well, thank you. I'll take it.
Not just a radio guy.
Yeah, not just a radio guy. Please go get the book, guys. And yeah, Ben is one of my oldest friends in the business. Do you remember, dude? We're I mean, you got a little gray in your beard now.
Yeah.
You realize we're coming up on, it'll be about 15 years.
Yes.
Since you and I sat next to each other at the Real News table at the Blaze. And I can just, it's crazy.
Which produced some incredible things came out of that table, including the current Secretary of War.
That was a great show. I mean, you got you, me, Hegseth, Will Kane. Guy Benson came through there, and Katie Pavlich. You go down the list. Carol Markowitz. I can't even name everybody. That show was like the training ground for the next generation of conservative talker folks.
It really was, and we had a great experience working on it together. I have to say, when it came to this book, I was not surprised that it's a good book, but I am. But I do think that one of the things that's interesting about it is you were able to connect a lot of different threads in this book that I think people might not be used to hearing you talk about. Meaning that you're talking about things that are being tools that are being used both by authoritarian regimes and then by people who just want to control the way that you think in the context of politics and media. And I think that it's very timely for a lot of the people who are looking back and judging their own feelings about what they experienced, particularly during the pandemic and during the summer of Floyd and everything else that came out of that, and kind of reconsidering, who was I listening to? What were they saying to me? Why did you choose this to be the thing that you wanted to hook your work, all of that work that you talked about on?
Well, thank you for also demonstrating for everyone that you have a fulsome understanding of the thesis and the purpose of the book, because that is not always the case on book tour. People are like, delusions. That sounds good, and you're just like, okay, I'll just take it from here. But no, everything you said is actually very much at the heart of what the effort was here. So I'll just work from the beginning of it. The kind of origin story of this book is after COVID, and I mean really after the dust settled, like after no one was getting the shot anymore or whatever. I just came up with this idea, and I just said, I need to understand how people can go so crazy. And there are some people you expect to go crazy, people that dye their hair purple and have like a bar through their nose and are covered in tattoos and think that AOC is like the second coming. And there are people out there who you can look at them and think there's some mental instability here. I'm just saying, but there are people that you would assume are susceptible to tactics of what in psychology, and I do get into the kind of canon around this as well as some of the history, they call coercive persuasion. And anybody who's familiar with cults and cult indoctrination, for example, coercive persuasion is usually what they talk about. But I thought, how do people go crazy? Because we've seen this with COVID, but you mentioned BLM. We also saw it with BLM. And then we've also seen it with climate change. We've seen it with we've seen it with the trans issue big time. And in fact, I wish, one of my only regrets is that I couldn't include more of the recent extreme manifestations of the trans ideological phenomenon, which now is just, in some cases, breaks out into open violence, terrorist violence. Yeah. Just like a jihadi. I mean, these are effectively trans jihadis that are shooting up schools, right? Meaning they're not Islamic fundamentalists, but there's a similar process of coming to a point where violence is necessary. So then, Ben, I work backwards from what makes people, or how rather are people made crazy in politics, in the course of argument? How are they pushed toward mass hysteria? And I tried to take first a sort of scientific approach to it. I'm obviously not a scientist, but then again, a lot of the scientists who talk about this are morons. So, like Neil deGrasse Tyson goes on the Bill Maher show and says he doesn't know if men have an advantage over women physically in sports in general. So, I can actually point to scientists, never mind Fauci. Yeah. And I started with Pavlov, and I worked my way through totalitarian dictatorships. The Pavlov thing is different, but I can get into that. But on the totalitarian dictatorships, the 20th century saw the greatest experiments in mass psychological coercion ever in human history, because it combined a technological capability, radio, mass-produced media, then television, with the coercive persuasion or coercive control techniques of the mind that have been around for a long time and have been perfected by demagogues and ideologues.
You have a passage in around the middle of your book where you talk about the elevation of this type of religious belief in the higher good as a motivator for people that basically this cannot be questioned. Thing is so obviously right that even if everything goes against it in terms of the facts that you're actually seeing, in the context of something like climate change, this comes up all the time, that the higher good is still this religious-like belief, and that the zealots that creates, are people who have a lot in common with the type of Islamic terrorists that you paid attention to and studied and worked on when you were working for the agency and working as an analyst. I am curious about, when you got into this, really, how much overlap is there? Because I think that that's not something that people naturally connect. But of course, you have an enormous amount of evidence that there are very similar attributes to both of these things.
So this was a huge thing, by the way, and even with I give my publisher at Penguin Random House real credit on this, because they put me through something of a murder board, which I don't know if we're allowed to use that term anymore, but this is what we call it in the agency. I think they call it a PhD defense, right? Where they're like, okay, but you want to talk about Stalinist gulags and the show trials. Obviously, there's something very different when you're looking at the trans phenomenon among kids in America today. And I said, no. I understand this. One has a massive government apparatus and extreme force and physical coercion at its disposal, but there are tactical similarities to the psychological processes that, basically, why, here's a perfect example of this. Why is it that if I'm locked in a Maoist, and they called it, and by the way, there's a lot of history in the book, which is why I think Ben respects it. There's a lot of history in the book that's really worth people knowing. Like, you'll learn when, he's laughing, he knows it's true. You'll learn where the term brainwashing comes from. I think people use this word all the time. They should know. It actually is an American neologism from Edward Hunter, a journalist. It's from wash brain, which was in Mandarin. And that was what people in China were saying was going on during the thought reform process. Thought reform was the official Chinese Communist Party re-education camp system. They called it thought reform. We started to call that brainwashing, because at its extreme, people felt like they were they looked like these husks that were repeating the demanded slogans. But to the point about where's the tactical similarity versus these things are the same. I get into, for example, confession and forced confession, essentially. Why is forced confession so important? Why in the Soviet Union would they have people during the show trials? And there's a whole chapter that gets into this. I mean, Ben, they could have just sent them to the gulag, put them up against the wall and executed them. They wanted the public display of self-negation and humiliation to show that we can break these people. And of course, it shows everybody else, we can break your mind too. Everybody knew that they could be executed by the secret police. I mean, that was already out there, but they wanted this public display. Okay, there's not a death squad on a college campus, but why is it that they will have you do a public confession? This happened at my college, by the way. People would have to do this public note in the campus paper. I'm sorry for the south of the border party. This happened to me, by the way. I'm sorry for the south of the border party with all of the, and Ben, I apologize. I know your background. All of the Mexican appropriation that was going on.
I don't have any problem with that.
Right. Well, I'm just saying, Latino appropriation everywhere. Why is public confession so important? Because it's a sign of control. Why is it that whether you're in a Chinese thought reform camp, essentially in the 1950s, or you're dealing with a cult on U.S. soil that has, you can walk out at any moment, but why is it that confusion and degradation, self-degradation, are central in those processes? And then I say, look at these tactics, look at how they are the same for the purpose of mind control, and then see how the left is doing this to people. And I'm going to say this too, I'm seeing a little bit of this on the right these days as well, which is a whole other phenomenon that did not exist when I was writing this book. But people on the right have started to go a little crazy too. Some of this has been done to them. And I really feel like this is a warning. That's why manufacturing delusion is so important. People need to know how this stuff happens.
And the other thing that reading Manufacturing Delusion reminded me of was there's a scene in one of the TV spin-off seasons of Fargo. I can't remember which one, where it's a unrelated throwback scene to someone who's living under communist Soviet occupation, and it's a guy who's being brought in for what he discovers is an interrogation at a police station, where he's basically informed that he has been convicted in absentia of murdering someone, and he has a whole explanation for why they got it wrong. It's a case of mistaken identity. They have the wrong address. It's basically like, I don't live at this address. I live at this other address. And the power guy behind the desk basically says, well, in order for that to be right, well, then the state would have had to make a mistake. And that's the thing that confronts him in that moment when he knows that he's doomed. And to me, that's really what we were kind of going through, not in a physical sense, as you say, but throughout the whole believe the science kind of moment that we all lived through, where it was like, but for your case to be right, you have to be saying all the science is wrong, as opposed to anyone actually evaluating things on a rational basis. How do we recover from that? Because you talk about the experience of PTSD that comes out of a lot of this in your book.
Yeah.
What is it in terms of a recovery moment from that PTSD that a lot of, particularly the younger people who live through it, Zoomers and people in college and the like, are living with today?
Well, in Manufacturing Delusion, there are some quotes peppered in from Solzhenitsyn, because if you're going to talk about the totalitarian control, and everyone should understand as well that the Chinese communists were really just a bastardized offshoot ideologically of the Soviet communists. And with that, Mao doesn't actually win without a lot of help from Moscow, and a lot of the system was borrowed. And then North Korea is the third order of that. So this whole thread of totalitarianism and the mind control that comes with it, there are variations on that theme across billions of people throughout the 20th century that they had to deal with, or certainly maybe a couple of billion. But what you're mentioned though about the state has to be wrong, that's a thing in the Gulag Archipelago.
Yes.
And that actually Solzhenitsyn writes about how the people, and he would say you would get a tenor, they would call it, meaning you get sent to the Gulag for 10 years. And that was just kind of standard. Like, You're here, you're getting a tenor. And people would say, but I didn't do anything. Mm-hmm. And that actually itself was proof of the need for you to go to the Gulag, because if you're saying, I didn't do anything, you're saying the people who brought you here are wrong, that the state is wrong. And how dare you take this even further than your crime, right? So the pushback against the crime, against the totalitarianism itself, is used as evidence. So it's funny, I didn't know that was in Fargo, but that comes straight out of the Gulag Archipelago. I mean, that's a whole sequence.
I was trying to give people a little bit more a little bit more friendly entryway, but yes. But I mean, Fargo, I mean, it's a brilliant sequence, and also I might add the jailers, the torturers, becoming increasingly frustrated with people who think that it matters whether you did it or not. You're here, and I'm doing my job, and this is the job, and this is what the state says. And there's a lot of that with COVID, because you saw people who were willing to not only adopt the procedures themselves, but they became the willing jailers for all of the rest of us. I mean, I still get like a seething feeling of rage when I go back in my mind to the airline attendants who were doing you're not masking up quickly enough in between bites. Remember, that was a thing. It was completely the most arbitrary use of power. I mean, it was like they were told, hey, you can give electric shocks if you want to anyone on this plane. Only do it if they're naughty. And they were just going, bzz, 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 just having a great time giving people shocks. But the whole point of Manufacturing Delusion is, how do you get people to think that that's okay? How do you get people to want to do that? And how do you get people to submit to that? And it happened in America. And I mean, I can get into Joost Meerloo, who's the author, or really the conceptual author of Menticide. He wrote Rape of the Mind. His whole thing was a lot of the stuff that the Nazis did, they were able to do because, they had guns at everyone's head and they had death camps. But the psychological breakdown and processes can be replicated in any Western democracy. And this was the guy who was like the forefather of this whole area of psychiatric study. You pepper throughout this book your experience around the globe, which is interesting. There's stuff in there, by the way, that I know that you've made mention of in the course of our friendship, but I still didn't know everything that was in there in terms of your own experience. I want to ask you, when it comes to the ability of Americans to resist this, I personally think, particularly, given the lesson of the last couple of years, that the number one thing I was wrong about when it came to America was I thought there would be more resistance here in America, more just natural,
Yes.
A stubborn refusal to go along with things, a backlash that would be much louder, that wouldn't be confined to, say, the Western states mostly. And that's something that, I was very sad to see play out, especially when it came to, for instance, the aspect that still sticks in my mind the most is when they were shutting down churches, which to me was just, unbelievable that there wasn't more of a rebellious attitude by people to that. When you look at your experience around the world, do Americans think of themselves as more resistant to this than other people for a particular reason? And how wrong are they about that? Do they have more in common with these go along kind of Europeans and the like, who we've seen become weaker and weaker in our lifetime?
This is a fantastic insight, and actually, I'm a little annoyed that I didn't include this in my book. So thanks, Ben, because I should have. Because this is where, and I really mean that. When you read the book back, by the way, for the audiobook of Manufacturing Delusion, which is great to listen to on your way to work, and I hope people will go download that or buy it. But there's always things that you go, I wish I, for me, it wasn't even that much. I wish I had done something differently. It was, I wish I had put more, or wish I had gone deeper in that. Like, there's more to do. Like, I felt as a listener back to my own stuff, or reading it and listening to it back in my head. And this is one area where, let me give you a perfect, I think, analogy here or whatever. Americans, yes, the first answer to your question is we think of ourselves as don't tread on me. And during COVID, we became mask up harder, whatever Fauci says. And that was a huge disappointment. It's one of the reasons I didn't leave New York City and move to Florida because of what de Blasio and the moron health authorities did there. I left because I realized I could no longer trust New Yorkers to be New Yorkers. To say, we're not going to do that. That's dumb. To have that question authority, to have that, hold on a second. Maybe we don't agree on all policy, but we got to keep the streets safe here. We got to keep the streets clean. No. It became mask up harder. And that was unacceptable. And that neighbors were policing each other, and neighbors were shouting at me outside. Yes. Put your mask on.
The narking was completely, this went from, that was the kind of thing I thought of was like, the territory of HOAs and people who have incredible amounts of time on their hands. It turns out when you give a lot of people time on their hands, they all become that type of person, or most of them do. And that surprised me. It frightened me. So how do we make sure that doesn't happen again?
Just one thing about this. I wanted to, Scotland. Have you been to Scotland? We think of Scotland in America. It's a beautiful country, but we think of it as Braveheart, badasses swinging their claymore, wearing their kilts, mountain people that will fight back. It's like, when I went to Scotland and I learned more about Scotland, they're a bunch of communists.
Yes.
This whole idea of this idea we have in our heads of the Scottish just like freedom fighters and the Highlanders and all this stuff, that was true 300 years ago. America has lost a little bit of its own Highlander, Appalachia, don't tread on me spirit. And that's why Manufacturing Delusion, I want my fellow Americans to recognize, once you add AI and tech, and the latest tech and all this into this world that we live in, the mass coercion that is possible technologically to sort of align our psychology with whatever the dominant messaging is, it's more powerful now than it has ever been. And we have already fallen victim to this, millions and millions of Americans at a time. So I feel that this is incredible.
You anticipated the next question that I had for you. Given the fact that we know that even without AI, there was enormous effort put in during COVID in particular, they ramped it up. But also, of course, in the aftermath of the Trump-Biden election, and even during it, you saw the importation of numerous different NGOs and the like who would do things in Europe that basically went after Americans talking online, saying that they were, participating in dangerous antisocial activity, that they were spreading, disinformation, dangerous disinformation and the like. And you saw our government be totally receptive to it under Joe Biden. Given the fact that they now are going to have these AI tools to do the same thing and to do it far more effectively and employ they don't need to be running around filing reports with Google and the like to achieve the same kind of thing. They can have AI do it for them. I worry that we are not awake enough to the danger of that too many people look at this past election, basically say, hey, well, Trump won, so things are going to be okay on this stuff. No, I think that they're just waiting. You're going to see all these people come back, and they're going to come back with a vengeance. What can we do about that?
That's a great question. And I think generally the weakest part of conservative books in the broadest sense is the here's how we fix America chapter. Usually at the end, there's, and this, you've been reading them for as long as I have, right?
I've edited many of those chapters.
Right. But it's like you go back to high school, even you're thinking about this. It's like, well, here's my 5-step program to take back America. It's not that simple, and you never really win. The fight continues forever. What you're identifying is, I think, an enormous challenge that Americans really need to wake up to. Because the ability to message, people will say, well, why do you focus on mass delusion? I started with Pavlov because that's really the scientific origin understanding of stimuli affecting you physically, but actually affecting your brain, meaning outside sensory stuff affects the body in physiological ways. And then right at the same time we understand that, you have Lenin and the biggest experiment in coercive mind control the world had ever seen, which was the Soviet system, and half the world behind the Iron Curtain and all the rest of it. But you can go to whether it's the witch craze of Europe, which was far worse than people talk about Salem. That was like a blip on the radar compared to what was going on in like Germany, where there were thousands of women that were being burned at the stake over centuries. And you go back into these periods where there's this. But of course, you can't reach everyone simultaneously. Same messaging, same. You could only start as far back as the printing press, and even the printing press, paper was expensive. It really is only a 20th century phenomenon where you have radio, where you have mass media distribution, where you have television, and we're now in the 21st century at this whole new level of not just constant information flow, including propaganda, which in Manufacturing Delusion, I get into a whole part about, look, propaganda is how they control your brain without any force, without any threats, right? It's the stuff it's the brain viruses that burrow in, that you let in. But a big part of that is our self-surveillance and self-training system that we have with these phones and the world of connected everything. Yes, it's amazingly convenient, but we're being messaged all the time. You know this, I know this, and I think everyone subconsciously has an awareness of this, but this is, you see how Europe has turned into a country, a continent overwhelmingly of wimps who just politically think, that, we can't stand up for what it is to be a member of this family of nations or a member of this group. And we have to just decide that we're going to let our Europeanness dissolve into nothingness. This is messaging from their government, messaging from their media. It's top down, and it has real effect. So, I want to see more Gadsden flags, literally and metaphorically, in America. The "don't tread on me" idea is something that needs to be far more important. It's don't tread on my mind. It's not just physically, it's mentally.
Manufacturing Delusion is the book. You should find it wherever books are sold. Congratulations, Buck, on your success with it, which does not actually surprise me.
So thank you. I appreciate that.
So even if
and now I'm going to return a compliment. You pull off that turtleneck nicely. It's got sort of Bond villain swagger to it. I got to give you props.
Gotta appreciate a good turtleneck. Yes. You can check out obviously Buck Sexton on X at Buck Sexton. You can subscribe to the Clay Travis and listen to the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton show. Thank you so much, Buck, for taking the time to join me today on the Big Ben Show.
Thank you, man. Good to see you, Ben.
Great to be with you. Thank you for listening to another edition of the Big Ben Show. You can follow us on Instagram and on X at Big Ben Show Fox. Check out the clips and please share them with your friends. We'll be back next week with more to dive back into the fray.